Episode 32 of the reading of Michael McCoy's Garden, the 11th of January 1999. The Melaleuca stiphyloides I inherited with this house is just now at its floral best. I've never really given this species the time of day before, but have been forced to view this specimen several times a day from the kitchen window and have come to love it. I can't imagine that this specimen is more than 15 years old, and it is only now starting to break up into the wonderful lumpy cumulus cloud structure one sees in older specimens. The growth within each lump is so tight and dense and of such uniform lengths that one gets the impression that the whole thing has been cloud pruned. In the older specimens, such as those in the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, the rich green clouds are held aloft by snaky branches of pale, layered bark that, like really flaky pastry, so thick that the trunk has a spongy feel. Young trees like mine also boast the bark, but the branching structure is yet to really show it off. At this time of year, and only for a week or so, the upper surface of each crown protuberance is iced, or at least sugared, in creamy flowers. They are of a remarkable petalless structure, being all anther, so the effect from a distance is of a creamy fuzz. The scent is cheap and soapy. So what? It gains its points elsewhere. Last night was so warm and humid that I had to go for a walk after dark. I'm not sure if the effect is physical, psychological, or both, but I often find that I return home from these warm evening walks absolutely elated. I don't want to be anywhere else. I don't want to be anyone else. I'm perfectly happy. Needless to say, this is not my normal state. Anyway, I went out with the thought that the night would be full of scent. The nosescape was in fact rich, but unvaried. The predominant smell was a not unsatisfying combination of warm, but slightly moist bitumen and eucalypt. On some evenings, every few steps takes me into a new olfactory zone, mostly with clear demarcations, but sometimes with the odd combination. I've often imagined marking the scent somehow or tagging them with different colours and wondered what patterns they'd make in the air at my height or how quickly they would diffuse together. I'm sure that many perfumes actually do make the narrow wavy lines that used to lift Yogi Bear off the ground floating as he sniffed to trace their source. But last night was perfectly still, and that's the only explanation for such a monotonous olfactory map on what I would have considered a perfect night for odour distillation. During one deep breath, I inhaled the smell of a recently lit cigarette, strangely warm and humid at first, but becoming downright gross by the third deep draught. The bitumen took a shift towards pine as I left the made roads, but one of my favourite spots, walking past a long hedgerow of some old rose along the boundary of a large wild garden, yielded absolutely nothing. I know there are liliums, roses and honeysuckle in there as I sniffed them out on other occasions, but last night there was nothing but eucalypt on the air. Just near home, I passed through a tiny, narrow band of an exquisite perfume that I didn't recognise. I ran back, trying to recapture it, but failed. Then came the familiar but delicious perfumes of Nicotiana and Lilium. They may have come from my own garden, but must have travelled some distance to do so, in which case, why wasn't the air full of other scents? 31st of January 1999. Though I haven't written about the garden for ages, it has been all systems go for months now. So much has needed to be done to bring the garden to any sense of completion, and it has all been such a mad rush that I haven't enjoyed it as I might, reducing the desire to write about it. The most satisfying bit has been watching the growth of things planted earlier, the astonishing growth. It was noticeable even when I was away from the garden for as little as 2 days. It was both infuriatingly and delightfully unpredictable. Some things refuse to grow as they should, and I can't help but despair at the gaps that will be left. But nearby, something unexpected has often self-sown, making a picture totally different from the one planned, and all the better for its spontaneity. There would have been a smug pride if it had turned out exactly as planned, but there's more room for pleasure in the humble position I'm forced to take. It has continued very, very dry. As was the case last summer, Melbourne has had the occasional reprieve, while we have had virtually none. The plants under trees in the woodland garden have been very slow, so that it still looks as if it's only just been planted, and I put this down to the dry weather. I planted 2 English box from large pots the other day and found the soil to be bone dry to a spade's depth. Not much wants to grow at all in these conditions, let alone grow quickly. Of course, the shade also slows things. The lack of sunlight obviously limits the plant's ability to harness the carbon dioxide required for its building blocks. For this reason, I've learned via much pain and suffering, it's worth giving plants growing in shady conditions every other advantage you possibly can, so as to compensate for the handicap. My plants have had the best of soil preparation, but I cannot, or rather will not, give them all the water they desire. The trees overhead are thirsty enough to drink the local reservoir dry, so there's no real hope of keeping the water up to the plants beneath. If these plants largely fail this year, then I'll have to replace them with tougher ones. Public opening or not, this must be a real garden, with all its attendant and inevitable failures. But where there is none of the exuberant engulfing growth for which I'd hoped, neatness suddenly becomes desirable, and I want to have everything spick and span, with the bare soil covered in deep, rich compost. If it were all lush and verdant, I could also get away with a tatty lawn. As it is, the lawn needs to be kept at its best. The sowing of all those seeds last month has turned out to be a failure. Besides the nasturtiums, there are a few night-scented stock plants and a little mignonette. Nothing else came up. I expected the gravel to be the most perfect seed-raising bed, but perhaps it's been too dry, or the gravel gets too hot, or the seed was too old. As is always the case with gardening, there are so many possible reasons why something has failed that any attempt at an explanation is little more than a stab in the dark, despite what Garden Radio talkback experts would have you believe. I must say I admire the confidence of such experts, but I cannot help but admire confidence, even the misguided and ignorant sort.